Hello and welcome to HR Evolution's Leadership Lessons. Can you guess what is the number one deterrent to profit, progress, and productivity within organizations? I wonder what you would guess. Well, I'm going to leave you hanging on that for a moment and talk with you a little bit about um, something that is so detrimental that the impact of talent, technology, and budgets combined don't even touch the impact of this particular issue on profit, progress, and productivity. Have you guessed what it is? That's right, we're talking about ego. Ego, that big diesel elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. But yet we all have one, and we all are affected by others' egos. You know, ego thwarts profit, progress, and productivity more than talent, technology, and budgets combined. Can you imagine? You know, operating from ego, we do not inherently act in the collective interest of a team, group, or organization. So my big question is, why do organizations not only tolerate ego-based leadership, but pretty much ignore it altogether? You know, my experiences have been such that we see leaders get away with abhorrent behavior because they are financial contributors to the organization. Well, you know, he can be a little rough around the edges, but man, he brings in a truckload of money to the organization. And so therefore, while the impact is such that it's not seen from a financial standpoint, the detriment to what he's causing in terms of how he treats other people, potentially other clients for that matter, you know, there's not an understanding of what is actually lost versus what is gained. And so the opportunity cost of being just a little bit nicer is lost in this regard. And maybe it just doesn't come down to niceness. Maybe it's a whole other host of issues related to ego. But that's just one example that I can think of that I've personally witnessed in organizations that I've served and been a part of. You know, here we're going to, what I want to do is examine ego, self-awareness, charisma, and altruism as they all relate to one another. And I want to explore a little bit about the impact that each can have in the organization. But before I get into some of that, I want to share with you, I had put this question to social media, doing a little crowdsourcing to see what kind of response I would get. And the big question was, why do organizations tolerate ego-based leadership that leads them away from their stated purpose? And, you know, I had a number of interesting responses, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But, you know, it's interesting to me that while we're separate and distinct from others, you know, when we're guided by the ego, we're all working for the organization that has the same vision or the same purpose. And how often do organizations even really pull that out and articulate that and demonstrate for each individual staff member what their contributing role is to the overall purpose? Not just giving them a job description and saying, these are your duties, but making sure that there's a clear understanding and connection between how those duties contribute to the key performance indicators or the bottom line of the organization. You know, from a financial standpoint, from a quality standpoint, from a customer service standpoint, these are all things that need to be discussed and not assumed based on the job description or based on certain policies and procedures. They'll pick it up. They'll see the big picture eventually. Well, it doesn't serve anyone to let them guess about that. We need to provide that information right up front as leaders of an organization. And many try to do this through orientations, through onboarding process. And some organizations, you say orientation and onboarding process, they laugh at you and say, well, that sounds a lot like what I did my first week is I tackled a bunch of manuals, sat down at my desk and read copious policies and procedures for hours upon end. And that was my orientation. Unfortunately, that's not an orientation. That's exposure to the policies and procedures. That's about it. And a bigger picture needs to really be drawn out and designed for staff members to really see what they're contributing to and really to buy into it. We want that extra discretionary energy in our employees and our leaders, don't we? That's what we call engagement, is that additional energy that we wish to allocate towards a mutual ends or even an individual ends in a professional environment. So if I choose to contribute to help out a colleague or offer to help out a colleague, that's a decision as an individual that has now affected a larger group. And that's an ego-based decision. Do I want to help someone else or do I not want to help someone else? Is that going to benefit me or is it not going to benefit me? Those kind of things. But when you look at it from a standpoint of, does it meet the overall intention of the overall purpose of the organization? And that's to advance whatever the vision or mission of that organization is. And so obviously this whole issue around ego requires us to rise above our individual agendas and individual egos and to reset around what it is that we're collectively trying to achieve within an organization. So to that point, I want to share with you a little bit about some Facebook responses I've received in terms of the number one deterrent to profit, progress, and productivity is ego. So why do organizations even tolerate ego-based leadership that leads them away from their stated goals? Well, one response was because the people with big egos strongly believe in themselves and produce in ways that can be justified for the betterment of the company. And so there again, based on my first example, we see this quite often where this person brings in a truckload of money, never mind the fact that they're toxic and no one wants to work for them. These things often go ignored. And, I thought this response was interesting. There's an implication here in that no matter how the person behaves, that if they produce to an extent valued by the company, it's the production that matters, not the behaviors. And I think we've seen this philosophy in action through companies like Enron, through companies like Volkswagen and Dieselgate, where they've purported misinformation, misleading their customers consciously for generation of profit purposes. And obviously that's not very ethical. It's not a value that would be respected by their consumers, I'm sure of that. So that's an issue that still exists. And we have to hold each other accountable to these things. And I believe Volkswagen was, and later held accountable through a lot of fines, through a lot of issues with the courts. And I believe some folks lost their job, rightly so, and same obviously with Enron. The second response I received from the big question of why do organizations tolerate ego-based leadership is this question was, this response was interesting. They say, perhaps you shouldn't assume the stated goals carry equal weight, at least in the case of for-profits. The goal that is the most immediate is to look good and improve the quarterly numbers. And if you can't do that, survive as long as possible. So this person's perspective, it was kind of interesting. It's been my experience that for-profit companies are laser focused on short-term wins and quarterly numbers. And I would suggest that these goals do not have to be exclusive of one another, of being short-term focused and long-term focused. You make better decisions in the long run if one are a complement to the other. But if you make one decision exclusive of the other, then it is not likely to serve you in the short or long term. And this is all too often what is happening in a work environment is we're making decisions based on a short-term interest and not considering the long-term impact of that. And 99.9% of the time, it seems like those short-term decisions aren't the same of what we would choose if we were thinking about the long term as well. So that's something that really critical to think about is how are our short-term decisions supporting our long-term growth? Another response that was given is that we are hot-wired to be selfish. It's easy to see selfishness in others, but we have a blind spot for our own actions. When we take ego-based actions, we rationalize them into something that seems needed or wonderful. Pick your best excuse. It's true. We cannot totally separate ourselves from ego. It's a part of us. It's here that we point out that there are no absolutes. We're talking about human behavior, and there will be many gray areas to consider. It's not easy and does require a certain amount of discipline to be self-aware. However, note, obviously the benefits far outweigh the effort and time when we consider the reduced incidence of employee relations issues, the greater productivity that results, and the synergy of working as a group towards common goals. It's so much more fun. The fourth response that I received from the question of why are we tolerating these ego-based leaders is, isn't it everyone working towards the collective interest for selfish reasons? So let me repeat that. Isn't everyone working towards the collective interest for selfish reasons? What I interpret from this response is that everything comes back to self-preservation or self-service eventually. If pressed, I believe the responder would probably give me an example of a seemingly selfless act and how the giver would ultimately feel good about the act and therefore be self-serving. These altruistic behaviors are not the same as ego-based behaviors because they derive from an interest not to serve self, but others. So true, this is a causal benefit of good feelings when helping others. Enjoy it. The fifth response I received was, I think that those with egos manage to convince others to follow them. Not that they're smarter or more adept, but often are more salesy or good BSers, as this person described. And so my reflection of that is, here there seems to be an effort to equate ego with charisma. And charisma is the ability to influence others, being compelling, attractive, charming. That results in a devotion to that person, no question about it. And ego is viewed to be inextricably linked to the notion of charisma because of the outward influence. But can one be charismatic without being ego-serving? And I think there is an opportunity for that. I think there's plenty of space for that. We don't have to be egoic and self-serving and be charismatic. It's to be charismatic, for that matter. So one does not necessarily equate the other. But again, this is a part of our human conditioning, is to take little pieces of information and make wide guesses about what that interpretation means, or wide assumptions around that interpretation. We do it with terms like leaders and managers, and we use them interchangeably, though we recognize that they are very different things in practicality. Leaders are not managers. In the same respect as managers are not necessarily leaders. There's a different connotation, different focus to that. And that's something we can get into at a later date. But I wanted to share these processes and these thoughts around avoiding the number one deterrent to profit, progress, and productivity. And when it comes right down to it, when you lead from the soul versus the ego, you focus on building your awareness and the awareness of others' needs. And then you use this increased awareness to build better relationships across the entire team and organization. And that's suggested by Shay McConnon, author of 7 Keys to Employee Engagement. This approach of leading from the soul versus the ego provides really exciting possibilities for leadership and employee engagement. And those are 2 big issues facing workforce right now. With employee engagement, percentages and ratios are what they are right now, very low in terms of engagement numbers. We really need to, it's going to be valuable to step back and redesign our systems for a more logical alignment, leading to greater innovation. And so what I always say is, let's take a pause for the cause and say, is this working? If it's not, let's stand back and take a scientific approach to it and say, if this model's not working, what if we tweak it this way? Is that going to give us better results? And let's stand back and evaluate that. But we need to be willing to be a little more flexible in terms of the how, in terms of how we achieve our end goals. And that's more and more expected of us as leaders and as diverse organizations. It's also a talent management attractor to know that when you come into an organization that they're not so rigid about the how in terms of how things are achieved, but it's the outcomes that are of importance, and it's alignment of those outcomes in terms of the purpose of the organization. And what's going to guide all of those things is not the technical differences of how to accomplish that, but the values that are commonly upheld and a part of the culture of the organization that are ultimately going to keep our egos in check and make sure that they are not deterring any kind of profit, progress, or productivity. So that's it for me. If you have any questions on anything we talked about, want to share with any comments, feel free to do so. And please, as always, subscribe. I look forward to sharing some more information with you again and helping you grow forward. Thank you and have a good day.